Welcome to Bailiwick Podcasts. I'm Jodie Yettram, and today we're exploring a form of domestic abuse that isn't always visible: coercive control. As the government launches a new awareness campaign to encourage victims to come forward, I speak with a woman who knows firsthand just how devastating this hidden abuse can be. Sam Billingham is a survivor who spent years trapped in a controlling relationship. Now she's using her experience to help others, raise awareness, and to push for change. In this episode, she shares her story, the red flags to watch out for, and what needs to happen to better support victims. Sam, thank you so much for being here today to chat to us. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to chatting to you. Just to jump straight in, really, if you're comfortable, I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit about yourself, about your story, and about how you became an advocate for survivors of domestic abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my lived experience with you today. So I'm Sam Billingham. I'm a survivor of coercive control and domestic abuse, and for the last 20 years of my life I've dedicated it to raising awareness for others, and I run my own online support group called SODA, which stands for Survivors of Domestic Abuse. So my experience started in the early 2000s. So it was around 2001 when I first met him in our local pub. It was Friday night, I'd just finished work, went into my local pub. And it sounds really cheesy and corny, but as soon as I saw him, I really liked him, really fancied him. Went over to him, started talking to him and his friend, and having kind of everyday general conversations that we do when we meet people. Where do you live? Where do you work? So told him I was very local, told him all about my job, kind of told him everything really, but again, it's something that we do every day, so there was nothing to think that there was anything wrong with this. Lots of people in the pub kept coming over to me, telling me what a great guy he was, how he'd look after me, so he seemed really, really popular as well. So I didn't think anything of it. He asked me to go to the next pub with him, and he told me that he really liked me. So he kind of made me feel really special from the beginning, really. I really liked him, he made me feel special. He said all the right things, and I moved into his flat with him 2 weeks later, which I now know is a massive, massive red flag for anybody. The relationship just moved really, really quickly. So I was in my early 20s. I was a legal secretary at the time when I met him. I was living at home. Life was just brilliant. And then I left home and moved into a flat with this person. And again, no indication that he would ever hurt me. He was very charming. And coercive control starts very, very subtly. So it was something as simple as, don't go and see your mum tonight. If you love me, you won't go. And it was at the honeymoon period of the situation where any relationship is very exciting and you really do want to spend that time with that person. So I didn't go and see my mum that night, but then I saw her less and less. And then when I did see her, there was always a consequence that I had to pay. And it was the same for when I went out with friends. So the first time I went out with a girlfriend, as we do as young men and women, I got dressed up in my favourite outfit because it made me feel good. He told me I looked like a slut. I went to the pub, which was less than 10 minutes away from the flat, walked into the pub, ordered my first drink, and I was just bombarded with so many phone calls and text messages. Again, that kind of theme of, if you love me, why did you leave me on my own? Why have you gone dressed out like that? Again, I didn't even manage to have any sip of my drink. I just went straight back to the flat because it was just easier. One of the odd things that he used to say was the only way I got my job was by sleeping with my boss. And I just found it a bizarre and strange thing to say. I really didn't think anything of it until one morning he locked me in the flat and threw my mobile phone out the 7th floor window so I couldn't phone in work. 2 days later, when I managed to get through, the first place I went was back to my workplace because, you know, I absolutely love my job. And it was really difficult at that point because there was no physical violence at this point. It was all control, and I didn't have a clue what coercive control was back then. But I knew I had to try and explain to my boss, and it was really hard because I didn't understand it myself, and I've got to try and explain it to my boss. He just threw his arms up in the air. He didn't want to know, and I was instantly sacked on the spot for making or trying to make a domestic abuse disclosure. And that for me was when I lost Sam. I got no sense of belonging anymore, no sense of direction, and that's when the control just increased. So I was timed when I went to the toilet. He would stand outside the toilet door looking at his watch going, "You've been phoning your mum, you've been texting your mum." He would physically get inside the bath with me. I couldn't have a bath alone. And the only place I could go on my own was shopping. And again, I was just bombarded with so many phone calls and text messages. And of course, I did phone my mum. Of course, I did go and see my mum. But there was always a consequence that I would have to pay. So early one morning, I felt him get out of bed. And my instinct told me to get my phone, which was on the bedside table. So he got up early hours of the morning to phone my phone, which was always on silent because I was phoning my mum. And he actually rang my phone from outside the bedroom door because I wasn't quick enough to put the ringer on so it would ring out. He came into the bedroom, picked me up, threw me across the bedroom floor, and again, another phone out of the window because I'd been phoning my mum. And of course, I went out again with friends, a pub literally 5-10 minutes away from the flat. And when I got back, I would have to take my underwear off for him to smell to see if I'd had sex with anyone while I was out. So again, I didn't go out. And then when I did find another job, he would turn up unannounced at the workplace. So it was just easier and safe. When I say easier, I really mean safer for me not to do those things. There was physical violence. But the first time it happened, I wasn't strong enough to put coercive control and domestic violence together. So when he first slapped me, it was in the bedroom. He pulled me around, spun me around, slapped me, causing bruising to my eye. And we both just stood there looking at each other as if to say, wow, did that really happen? And then he started to cry, and then he apologised that it would never happen again. And in that moment, because I loved him and I believed him and I felt he wouldn't hit me again, you kind of go, oh, that's okay, that's fine. But the control was always there. The physical violence, so I was with him for around 3 years, and the physical violence wasn't every day, but it ranged from a slap to a punch to breaking my ribs to a kicking to being strangled with a kettle cord. And even though I knew those things weren't right, because I didn't understand what was happening to me by him controlling me, I didn't know that the whole situation was wrong. Because I think one of the important things to remember is that the perpetrator isolates us and they abuse us, but they're also the only stable person we've got, because they've isolated us from everyone, that we feel that we can't leave. I left several times during the 3-year period. He found me in a safe house. He would always apologise. He would always say how sorry he was. His mum would phone me and also kind of reaffirm everything that he was saying to me. You know, he's such a good lad, really. He loves you. And because I've been broken down piece by piece, you do believe them. He could have told me the sky was green and the grass was blue, and I would have believed him. I had a child with this person because I naively believed that by having a child together, he would change, that his behaviour would change, but it never did. She actually saved my life. So back in November 2006, he split my lip open whilst I was holding my daughter in my arms. She was 10 months old. And for me, that was my wake-up call. I knew I'd got to try and change the situation I was in because I knew his behaviour wouldn't change. And I got her in the pram one morning and I took her to my local police station and I made my final statement to kind of let them know what was going on. But after that, because he didn't have that power and control over me anymore, he took me through the family court. So he still wanted to maintain that power and control over me. He didn't necessarily want to see our daughter. And the intimidation and the humiliation of going through family court is horrendous. In time, he didn't turn up to any of the appointments, so I'm one of the lucky ones where it was actually thrown out of court, so he didn't get contact. But with coercive control, and the reason why at the beginning I said I'm a survivor of coercive control and domestic abuse is because I feel that we still focus purely on the physical violence. And domestic abuse isn't necessarily about violence alone, it's about that power and control. And that's where I've got a motto. People who follow my work, my motto is, if we're not talking about coercive control, we're not talking about domestic abuse, because it's there at the beginning, it's there at the end. So when I met him and he was so charming, that is part of the coercive control process. So when we do find that strength and courage to try and report it, people are very much like, oh, but they're lovely. That person's really nice. You know, they help the little old lady across the road. And that's why I talk a lot about coercive control. So here in England, it's actually a crime under the Serious Crime Act 2015. But through the work that I do, coercive control is still misunderstood by a lot of professionals, which is why I advocate and I do a lot of work like this to educate society as a whole, really, because perpetrators, whether male or female, are very, very clever people, and it's not just the survivors they manipulate, they do manipulate professionals as well. So to have an opportunity like this today to speak on your podcast is really empowering for myself, because I want to educate society as a whole around coercive control.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your story so candidly, Sam. Looking back, were there any sort of warning signs that you didn't really recognise at the time? I know you mentioned you moved in after 2 weeks, and it almost sounds like he was like love bombing you in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think this every time I share my story. There were so many signs there, but I didn't know what coercive control was until I'd come out of that situation. So I really did learn the hard way, like many, many women do. So obviously the biggest red flag was moving into someone's flat with them 2 weeks after meeting. But also not phoning my mum. You know, when we get into a relationship, we should be able to still have the freedom to go and visit our parents, to go and visit our family. He could do those things. He was very close to his mum. It was okay for him to do that, but it wasn't okay for me. And the other thing was about the clothes that I wore. So when I met him, I'd got a certain style of clothing that I wore. It wasn't like I was changing my appearance for that night to go out. But it's like everything that we've, our values, everything that we do, they really unpick that and change that from the beginning. So that's why it's really important to talk about coercive control, because I was a very strong, bubbly, really, really confident person, and he stripped all that away from me. So by the time I tried to report it to my boss, instead of actually saying, you shouldn't be sacking me because I've done nothing wrong, I was really weak and vulnerable at that point. So I went, yeah, okay, because the perpetrator had made me believe that I shouldn't have that job in the first place, because why would somebody like me get that job? So it has a massive impact on your mental health. I know you just said there about the domestic violence and then coercive control. With coercive control, I've been out of that situation for almost 20 years. The perpetrator is deceased, but it still has a massive impact on my life. And I've got a real good example that only happened on Friday. So on last Friday, there was a massive trigger. Somebody knocked on my front door. I didn't answer it because something told me not to. And it was actually a scam artist who said I owed money. So they'd put a note through my door saying, call this number. There were 2 references on there. So I was really petrified. So I got in touch with this company and I spoke to this guy on the phone. And he mentioned 2 dates. So he said to me, you're in debt with a credit card. You owe just over £2,000. And the one date he mentioned was 2006. And then the second date was 2010. But all I heard was 2006, because that is when I left the perpetrator. And I did have a credit card in my name when I was younger. So all that what he was saying to me could have actually happened. It didn't happen, but it was a massive trigger, and it took me back 20 years. It's only today I'm feeling a lot better, but over the weekend it's been horrendous, because the control is often worse than the physical violence. If you talk to any survivor of domestic abuse, they will often say, and I've said this myself, I would rather have had a beating every single day for those 3 years and not the coercive control, because it changes you completely. I risk assess everyone I meet. I try and work them out before I have a conversation with them, because that's my safety net. I've had triggers at work, so I haven't been able to work, I haven't been able to have certain jobs because I've been massive triggers. I didn't even know how to make a decision. So my dad would often ask me, oh, do you fancy going for a coffee today? And I'd be like, what do you want to do? Would you like to go for a coffee? And I never knew I did this until my dad said one day, how come you do that? And it's because I was still frightened of what the response that I gave, whether it was the wrong one, that I would, there'd be those consequences. I've only just, within the last 2 years, I've only just started looking in the mirror, only just started having my hair done, only just started going out because of the coercive control, because coercive control programs you, so the perpetrator programs you into a person that they can easily manipulate. And when you're out of that situation, you've got to unprogram yourself, and it's really, really difficult to kind of do that. So that's why it's so important to have these conversations around coercive control, because a lot of people think that domestic abuse is purely the physical violence side, and it isn't. And as I said, that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because we're just still not understanding the impact of coercive control either. So it's the awareness that we have to be mindful of, but also the long-term impact of that crime.
Definitely, and it's sort of almost like stripping away your sense of identity, and then you've sort of had to work to rebuild that in the years after, and that sounds like it's been really challenging in itself. But now I wanted to speak a little bit about your advocacy work, if that's okay, and about SODA. When did you set it up? What sort of motivated you to take that step to help others, and what impact really have you seen from it so far?
So I set up SODA back in 2009, so roughly 3 years after I'd left, and I used to volunteer at we've got something called Sure Start Centres, and I used to volunteer there, and the lovely volunteering coordinator, Sally, she said, have you ever thought about helping others? And my instant reaction was no, I can't do that, not me, no, why would I do that now? But she planted a seed, and the more I thought about it, the more I just wanted to be the support that I never had. So when I left that situation, I didn't get a support, I didn't get a helpline number, I wasn't signposted anywhere. It was kind of, right, that's it, get on with it. So Sally very kindly planted a seed, and it started off as an online support group for men and women to come together to share their lived experience with other people. Still active today. I've got about 1,000 members in the group, and it's a safe haven for them to come together. And then around 2 years ago, I was in a part-time job that I just found really boring. I got no excitement in this job, and I just thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be a lived experience speaker. So I gave up my part-time job, and that's what I do now. So I travel the country to share my lived experience with professionals, and it is so empowering. It is so empowering, because there are people out there who already do magnificent work around domestic abuse, but with what I do with lived experience, you're just complementing the work that's already been done. So we're all expanding our education around coercive control. So in August last year, I worked with our local BBC, and we did some research around coercive control awareness training in student social workers. And it came to light that they actually received very inadequate training around coercive control. And after people had seen me on TV around just that, coercive control, the amount of men and women who've contacted me on a daily basis to not only share their lived experience, but to also tell me where the failings are in the system, that's massive to me, because they're trusting me with their lived experience, and they've got this kind of, this image that I can help them somehow, that I can use my voice to be their voice, to share their story. So it's really empowering for me to be able to, and it's a privilege to be in such a position to kind of do what I do. And I'm glad I went through what I went through in a very strange way, because I wouldn't be able to do what I do now. So it's empowering for me, and it's also trying to give hope and inspiration to any man or woman who might be in that situation now, to kind of say you're not on your own, and there is support out there, and also there is life after domestic abuse. I've always been really open with my lived experience, the good and bad, because it's not easy to come out of that situation, because your life doesn't go back to how it was before that. It does change you. So it is a rocky roller coaster of a ride, but that's part of our journey. And as long as we all take one step at a time to get to where we want to be, we can achieve all those things that the perpetrator told us we never could. So it's just really empowering to be in such a position to do what I do. And I meet a lot of people who then want to go on and do this work in their area or in wherever they live. So we motivate each other, really. And it's just a privilege to do what I do.
That's amazing, Sam, that you've taken such a terrible experience and turned it around to be able to help other people in your situation. Is there maybe one success story that stands out of one particular individual that, you know, you might have really helped or made a difference in their life, or given them the power and the confidence to actually leave a situation?
I'm very down to earth. I'm very grounded. I just do what I do because I know it needs doing. I'm not one for recognition or anything like that. But I was at an event about 3-4 years ago, and this lady came up to me and she said, "Do you remember me?" And I was really honest, and I said, "I'm so sorry. No." She joined my online support group, SODA, and I was one of the very, very first people that she'd ever opened up to, and I gave her some advice on what she could do. And when it's online and you give people advice, it's obviously up to them what they choose to do. I don't make them do these things. I'll give them the information and, my knowledge, and then it's up to them what they do. And she actually did everything that I suggested, and she got away from this perpetrator, her and a child. So when I met her that night, she told me, and it was so emotional, and she said, "You saved my life." So to actually have someone in front of you say that was so emotional. I just couldn't, it was so emotional, because I don't really know what impact I have on people, because I don't know if they listen to me, I don't know if they do those things, but to have somebody actually say that, it was so powerful. And obviously that gives you the strength to carry on. Recently I had I'm on X, which is formerly known as Twitter, and I had a famous person get in touch with me, and she's actually signposted me to one of her best friends. So to have someone who's like on your TV screen to mention your name and the work that you do, and then kind of, make that signpost, make that referral, again, it's really empowering and showing me that what I'm doing is making a difference for those people who need it. So it's mind-blowing. Sometimes it's really surreal. Like now I'm sitting in my living room in England, and I'm talking to someone in another country about the work I'm doing, and it's like, it's just amazing. And people empower me. So those people who find the strength and courage to reach out to me, they empower me, because that's a massive thing to do, to sit there and say to someone, "This is happening to me, can you help me?" That is huge. So I think really we all empower each other, but it's about having those awkward conversations like we are now to give people the confidence to reach out to other people.
Definitely. And one part of your story that I would like to return to a little bit, if that's okay. You mentioned that when you made a disclosure to your boss, their reaction was to sack you, which is just absolutely horrific. I was wondering if you had any advice for any employers who might have noticed maybe a change in behaviour of one of their employees after they got in a new relationship, or if they've noticed that some telltale signs might be a little bit different. How could they go about having that awkward conversation and maybe, reaching out to them, or what should they do if someone approaches them and makes a disclosure? What would be your advice to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of reflecting on my own personal journey. So often, and the biggest thing I do think about is my boss's response. In my opinion, so I never made another disclosure after that. So I didn't open up to the police, no professional, no one, because I felt if anyone knew me, it would be my boss, because I was always early, I never left on time, I always worked to the best of my ability, I was really good at what I did. And over the years, I've come up with like a little checklist of what he could have actually done. And this is kind of something all practitioners can use in their everyday practice, especially employers, is the ABC checklist of coercive control. So my appearance, so I was a legal secretary, so I'd always got a suit on, but my appearance changed dramatically. You know, I didn't have a wash sometimes, I didn't brush my hair, didn't brush my teeth, didn't do anything. My body language, again, that was something that changed. So as I'm talking to you now, you know, I'm looking at eye contact and my body language is really positive. But in that situation, I wouldn't look at anyone, I wouldn't make eye contact because there was always a consequence. So he would accuse me of having an affair with anybody that I looked at, whether it was male or female, whether I was related to them or not. And conversation, I didn't know how to have a conversation like this. It was just, okay. Because again, if I was having a conversation with someone, it was either because I was having an affair or I fancied them. So those three things, appearance, body language and conversation, is something that colleagues can look at if we notice something different in one of our colleagues maybe. But the biggest thing to anyone who is really lucky enough to hear a disclosure, and I'll say that because it's massive making a disclosure, because you feel embarrassed, you feel ashamed, we've already been manipulated and told that no one's going to believe us and no one's going to help us, so we've already got all that inside us. And then my experience of someone kind of dismissing what I'm saying has really confirmed everything that the perpetrator has said. So if anybody does make a disclosure to you, listen. They don't want to be fixed, they don't want you to be the counsellor, they don't want you to take them out of the situation, they just want you to listen and believe them. As humans, it's human nature, we want to save everyone and kind of jump in there and help them, but with coercive control and domestic abuse, we can't do that. So we've literally just got to listen and believe them and be there for them when they're ready to open up more and when they're ready to maybe go to the police station, help them, you know, can I come with you? Do you want to use my phone? Those simple things can really make a difference to anyone who is in that situation. Here in England, we've got an organisation called Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, which we shorten down to IDA. I'm an ambassador for them now because they provide free resources for employers to support staff who make a disclosure. So there's lots of resources out there and lots of support for employers to help their employees when they do make that disclosure. But the biggest thing really is believe them and listen. If you're working with someone or you think someone might be experiencing domestic abuse, are you okay? Start a conversation. You know, you might be making a cup of tea in the kitchen or in the staff room. You might have noticed a change in their appearance or body language or conversation. Just say, are you okay? Because that question is putting the emphasis on that person, and that's big because in an abusive situation, we don't get that because our focus is on the perpetrator. It will take time for them to open up to you. They might just go, yeah, I'm fine. But be persistent. Ask them the next time you see them, or if you're watching a soap that's got a domestic abuse storyline, just say, oh, I saw EastEnders or whatever the soap is, and kind of get conversation flowing that way, just to help them open up, but in their own time. So the most important thing is to listen to them.
Definitely, and thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really, really important advice. And another thing you mentioned was the need for sort of better education around coercive control, and you said that a lot of social workers maybe aren't being adequately trained. But maybe could you elaborate a little bit on what you think sort of professionals should be doing to help prevent abuse, and what exactly should they be learning about in order to better support people going forward?
Yeah, again, I think it's all about that coercive control. It's all about we have to see those visible injuries. We have to wait till someone's murdered or killed before we act, whereas coercive control is the thread that runs through domestic abuse. So that tells us lots of things. So lots of perpetrators will always tell you exactly what they're going to do if you really, really listen to them. So in my situation, he always told me I was a crap mum. I'm going to get social services involved. I'm going to get it taken off you. Social services were involved. And when she came to my front door, I can still remember the way she looked at me. She looked at me like she just stepped on me on the pavement. She looked at me as though I was a bad mom. But she wasn't there because I was a bad mom. She was there because the police had got in touch with her because I was a victim of domestic abuse. But when I opened my front door and she couldn't see those visible injuries and she wasn't aware of what coercive control was, she automatically assumed that I was just a rubbish mom. And I think a lot of professionals are actually being failed when they're not being trained in coercive control, because how can they do the job if they don't know, if they haven't got the education or tools to do those things? And it's really difficult because a lot of these professionals, police, social workers, doctors, health visitors, they've done a job a certain way for 30 years that we've got to kind of unprogram them to think a different way as well. So it's a really tricky situation for everyone involved. But the more we talk about it, the more we all learn from each other, really. And as for education, nobody wants to think about our children going through a situation like that, but we have to be realistic, and perpetrators and survivors are getting younger. So we really do need education in schools and colleges and universities, and especially around coercive control, because as you mentioned earlier, the love bombing. So love bombing is when you meet somebody and, you know, they tell you you're amazing and they might buy you loads of gifts and things like that. And to somebody young, that is nice, that's lovely, but I always twitch when I hear things like that, because that's that control, that is coercive control, because what they're saying is, I can buy you these things and do this for you, and then I can treat you however I want. So it's really important that we get the education in there for our young people as well, because it just really destroys and devastates lives, basically, and that's coercive control on its own. So you include the domestic violence as well, and it's just horrendous. And we see lots of men and women, mainly women, who are killed by perpetrators because of domestic abuse. And my opinion is, the more we know about coercive control, the more early prevention around that work, we can see less domestic abuse, homicides and things like that happening if we take coercive control as seriously as we do about domestic violence. I know many people who've never ever been physically hit, but they've been completely controlled. And that is just horrendous, because I don't know how they're still standing or how they're still functioning. But we've got to take it much more seriously than we do already. I had a phone call this morning from someone here in England. She told me she'd reported coercive control, lots and lots of evidence, dismissed, not seen as coercive control, or hasn't done anything to you, hasn't hit you, we're not going to proceed. And that is the common theme that I'm finding here in England from people who reach out to me. There's a pattern in how the police are responding. And again, if they've done something for so many years one way and we're trying to tell them to do it a different way, it's difficult for them. And it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time to get people talking about coercive control and getting that education and awareness in there. But by doing things like what we're doing, at least we're starting that conversation and making us start to create that change.
Definitely. And I'm speaking from you in Jersey in the Channel Islands, and I just wanted to talk a little bit now about our laws surrounding domestic abuse and coercive control. So we introduced our first domestic abuse law in 2023, which made coercive control a crime. How important is it to have specific laws that specifically recognise this type of abuse as what it is, rather than just putting it under, you know, assault or something like that? Why is it so important to have these specific laws?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I only found out recently that here in England, and it's probably the same, domestic abuse is not a crime. So domestic abuse itself is not a crime, but as you say, stalking and harassment, GBH, ABH, those are crimes, but actually domestic abuse isn't. I think having coercive control as a crime is really, really important, because that is what has a massive impact on a survivor's life. That is what, you know, it strips you of everything. It makes you weak, it makes you vulnerable, it makes it easier for the perpetrator to abuse you. And I think it's important that we identify that, because the sooner we identify that, the less likely the violence and the murder is likely to happen, because it's early preventative work. But again, as I said, it's very much, we've got to wait till something really bad happens before we can do anything. And my kind of argument is, but if we all know about coercive control, the awareness, the impact, then we can do more things in the early stages rather than waiting until it's too late. So here in England, we've just had something where we're putting professionals in the control rooms, of 999 control rooms, which is great, but we need to do more before it gets to that stage. What are we doing before it gets there? I don't want it to get that far. I don't want any man or woman or young person making a 999 phone call, because when it gets to that point, it's too late, because we're abused, we're controlled, we're physically hurt many times before we make that phone call. When we make that phone call, that is really our cry out for help, that we can't take anymore. I can't take anymore. So we need to understand coercive control and talk about it a lot more before it gets to that stage, because I think it could help save lives. I really do. I really do think if we take it seriously, we document it properly, we keep notes of everything that's been disclosed to us, we can piece it together to see the bigger picture before it gets to the 999 call.
Yeah, definitely. And just again, speaking locally in terms of Jersey, so some campaigners here are concerned that the law that came into force a couple of years ago doesn't cover historic offences, so, you know, offences that happened before 2023. And the Home Affairs Minister has said, you know, making it retrospective would be fundamentally unfair, is what she said. And I just wanted to ask you, what's your take on that? Should we still count historic abuse under the law, or what do you think about this?
Yes, I think we definitely should, because 9 times out of 10 a perpetrator has a history of domestic abuse. So when I lived with that person for 3 years, I thought I knew him. I thought I knew, you know, when you live with somebody, you find out lots about them. When I got out of that situation and he was taking me to court, I ended up seeing his criminal record, and he was known to the police. So the police already knew what he was like. He'd had he'd had lots of partners, but he'd had 2 other children with 2 different women, and he treated all of us exactly the same. So he'd got a history of domestic abuse. We've got something called Clare's Law here now in England, and maybe if I'd have known about Clare's Law then, I might have, you know, challenged that Clare's Law, and I might have left a lot sooner. So I think it's really important that we have to know about the history to see the bigger picture. And it, as I said, 9 times out of 10, perpetrators do have a history of this behaviour. So again, I think that's keeping the survivor safe, because if we've got that information and we know about that, we can leave a lot sooner rather than later. So yeah, I think it's really important that we find out as much as we can about perpetrators, because it kind of tells us that story about who they are and what they're doing. If I didn't know about his previous, I could have lived the rest of my life thinking, well, actually, maybe it was all my fault. But in reality, domestic abuse only happens because perpetrators choose to abuse. We don't ask to be abused. I didn't wake up one morning and say, right, you know, I'm going to meet a man and I want him to treat me like that. But without the information on his previous, I could have thought that way. So I do think it's really important that we know about the history, because a lot of them give excuses as to why they behave that way. It could be alcohol, it could be substance misuse, it could be because they've had a bad childhood, things like that. And we survivors believe those things, but without that extra evidence and that historical evidence, we would blame ourselves. But with the evidence, it's clear that it's because of the perpetrator.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing up Clare's Law. I think that's really important. We do have that over here in Jersey, and it's quite sort of widely advertised, which I think is really, really important. But just a couple final questions, really. For anyone, you know, in Jersey who is living with coercive control, but they haven't yet found a way out, what would you say to them?
So the first thing I would say is it's not your fault. No matter what the perpetrator says to you, it is not your fault. It's not something you've done. It's not something you've said. It happens because they choose to treat you that way. there is support out there. It's just having that strength and courage to phone that helpline or to reach out to that organisation. And it is about understanding that not everyone's a perpetrator. So when we do find the strength and courage to leave, not everyone's going to treat you that way. And also our healing journey, it's as unique as we are. So I get a lot of people ask me, oh, when will I get over it? The reality is we don't get over it, but we learn how to deal with the cards that we've been dealt. So it's just taking one step at a time to get to where you want to be. But the biggest key message is it's not your fault.
Yeah, definitely. And for those who want to sort of learn more about you and your story and your work, how can they find out, and how could they maybe get involved with or support SODA?
Brilliant. So my website, I've got a website which is www.sodahq.uk. And I'm all on social media, so if you type in Sam Billingham, I'll pop up here, there and everywhere. The work I do is for men, women, young children, young people. There's no kind of barrier to who I'd support. So if anyone is out there and wants to have a conversation, please do get in touch with me.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much for sharing your story and sort of for speaking so openly about this issue. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Bailiwick Podcasts. This episode was brought to you by Bailiwick Express and the Jersey Evening Post. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, support is available. Contact Jersey Domestic Abuse Support on 01534 880 505 or FREEDA's 24-hour helpline at 0800 735 6836. Thanks again for listening.